I'm here today with Jenn Turnham. She has a strong background in applied psychology, and she has been using her knowledge, training, and experience in helping people use the power of their minds to overcome challenges since 2008. She now focuses on helping HSP-E women thrive in a world that currently doesn't quite understanding them, helping them see their sensitivity as their superpower. Well, with that, I want to welcome Jenn Turnham to the Chaos and Light podcast. Hello, Jenn.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk about this. So let's. I always like to give my listeners an idea of your background and the work that you do with clients. So if we could start there, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. I'll give you the abridged version of the background. So, I have a Bachelor of Psychology and I spent many years delivering psychological safety training programs in the mining industry. So it was basically psychology applied to keeping themselves safe. We also did a lot of applied CBT, so how to apply cognitive behaviour therapy to get what you want out of life. I then moved into psychology applied to leadership. So I was facilitating training programs around that. And then I did a complete 180 in my life, and I won't go into the details, but it was basically due to family tragedy. I decided to give up my career and chase my dream to be a singer. So I made that come true, and I was the singer in a rock band, and it was the scariest but the best decision of my entire life. So I made that dream come true, and the feeling of being up on stage with the band, literally living my dream, was one of the best times of my life. And then unfortunately, I got what at the time was a mystery illness, but I now know it's ME, commonly known as chronic fatigue. I don't like calling it chronic fatigue because people think, oh, you must just be tired all the time. And it's so much more than that. There's a lot of neurological deficits and a lot of other symptoms. But due to that, unfortunately, I had to give up the singing. And so then I was looking for something more sustainable that I could do. And that's how I got into coaching, because I thought, well, I've got a psychology degree. I can help people. My background is in applying psychology to life and to transforming lives. And then one day I stumbled onto the research around HSPs, because when I did my psychology degree, that was around the same time that Dr. Elaine Aron was doing all the research to kind of uncover this thing that we now know as sensory processing sensitivity. So we didn't cover it at uni. But when I stumbled across it, it was kind of like this light bulb moment for me. It was that final missing piece of the puzzle, because what I realized is I'm a HSP extrovert, which is very unique because most HSPs are introverts. And so that's why I've always known I was an extrovert, but I never still quite fit that mold. And so when I came across HSPs, that was, as I said, the kind of missing piece in the puzzle. And through that, because it just gave me so much understanding, which has then led to more acceptance as well, and now kind of going out into the world and crowing about how good HSP extroverts are, I thought, well, that's the perfect niche for me to focus on. So that's how I now kind of got into specifically helping highly sensitive extrovert women. So I've got a Facebook group of almost 700 highly sensitive extroverts, and I do one-on-one coaching. I also have online courses, and I've got a group membership as well. So that's how I help them. I'm also currently writing a book because there is pretty much nothing out there for highly sensitive extroverts, because all of the literature, because 70% of highly sensitives are introverts, all of the literature, well, most of the literature pretty much only refers to the challenges and the experiences of life for the HSP introverts. So my ladies are saying, yes, please write the book.
Well, I have lots of questions about actually you touring and performing and all of that. But let's back up. Let's start giving my audience a definition of what a highly sensitive person is first, and then we'll branch into when you add that E to the end, meaning that they're the extrovert. Because you're right, I've heard of it, and my assumption was always that almost all HSPs were introverts, and that's why that was like part of their sensitivity.
Yes. Yeah. And it is a very common misconception. And that's kind of why I'm out here doing this sort of stuff. So, HSP, the scientific term is actually sensory processing sensitivity, which is a real mouthful. I prefer HSP. The reason being, if you say, I am a HSP, that sounds very different to I have sensory processing sensitivity. To me, that sounds like it kind of puts us in the potentially in the realm of there's something wrong with us. And so many HSPs grow up already thinking there is something wrong with them because they are a minority and they're very misunderstood in the world. That's why I prefer using the term HSP, but the official term is SPS. So HSP, there's 4 criteria, and this was coined by Dr. Elaine Aron. So I have to give her a shout out for all her research around this because it changed my life and now it's helping me change lots of other people's lives as well. So the DOES criteria, DOES, they're the 4 criteria that make up being a HSP or having sensory processing sensitivity. D is depth of processing. So our brain is a hive of activity non-stop all the time. So people commonly refer to that as being overthinkers. So we tend to feel like we overthink, but really it is just our brain is wired differently and we process everything at a much deeper level. So an example of that is, let's say you're trying to remember a phone number. The opposite of deep processing, shallow processing, I suppose we call it, would just be repeating the mobile phone number and over in your head to try and remember it. Deep processing, what happens at a brain level is we're actually looking for links, we're looking for patterns, we're matching it with previous information and seeing how it fits with that. And that happens for HSPs all the time. So non-HSPs do engage in deep processing, but for HSPs, it's kind of the norm. So you can imagine that that can be quite exhausting for HSPs to be processing everything all the time. The O is for overstimulation. So we have a highly active nervous system. So noises, crowds, busyness, all those sorts of things can actually cause us to become overstimulated. And when that happens, we need to essentially take some time out to rest and recharge. So HSPs traditionally have challenges at maybe rock concerts, rush hour if they're commuting to work can be quite overstimulating for them. They react to like a irritating tag on clothes. Those sorts of things can get to us as well because of the impact it has on our nervous system. So that's the D and the O. The E is emotional responsiveness, reactivity, and empathy. So what that pretty much means is the simplest way to explain it is we have very, very high levels of empathy. So HSPs are very empathetic. So our mirror neurons are more active than non-HSPs. So mirror neurons are basically, if you watch somebody kicking a soccer ball, the neurons in your brain, as if you were kicking the soccer ball, actually activate. So HSPs mirror neurons are much more active than non-HSPs, and the emotional responsiveness and reactivity pretty much means that our emotional, I suppose, range is much greater than a non-HSP. So the way I like to describe it is if you imagine just the general ups and downs in life that most people have, our ups and downs, so our peaks and troughs are kind of much more pronounced than a non-HSP. And so in extroverts you would notice that much more because we show things more in our face and we're much more external than introverts. But introverts do still have those higher peaks and troughs. It might not be as visible for you if you're with them. And the final one is sensitive to subtleties. So that's the S in the DOES criteria. And that one is we notice things that non-HSPs don't. So we're the ones who'll notice if you've had a slight trim on your hair or if you've added a fringe or all those things that quite often husbands and partners don't notice typically. HSPs will be the one to pick that up. And we also notice very subtle changes in facial expressions, tones of voice, things like that. And so that's one of the things that leads to HSPs sense of intuition. But then one of the challenges is a lot of HSPs ignore and disregard their intuition because they're very, how do I explain it? Their tendency is to give other people the benefit of the doubt. So often that's one of the things I work with clients is how to stop ignoring your intuition, how to start honouring it, because it is a superpower. We can pick up a lot of stuff that non-HSPs the information still goes into their brain, but they're not that we're always aware of it, because sometimes it is just a sense, but our brains pick up more than non-HSPs. So that's the very condensed version of what the DOES criteria are. I've done a whole session on just that. So,
and I'm listening to this and going back to you being in a band, and I'm thinking that's in direct, opposition to this idea of overstimulation, right? Because I can think of nothing more overstimulating than being out in front of a group of people and you're feeding off their energy and they're feeding off your energy, and it's about the experience and all of that. So somewhere there's got to be, tell me what I'm missing as far as the extrovert.
Okay, so that when you add extrovert to HSP, that's when things get really interesting. And the way I like to describe HSP extroverts is pretty much we're walking contradictions. And the reason
okay, there we go.
there you go. So the reason for that is because, as you've just heard, my description of HSP, the trait, it is actually quite similar to the traits of an introvert, because introverts are inwards focused, they get overstimulated, they need downtime, they're more comfortable being alone than extroverts are. So the main difference is that extroverts crave external stimulation. So if you kind of put that with the HSP trait, the biggest challenge is we're always trying to find this equilibrium and do this balancing act, because what will happen is, so the band, for example, that was obviously serving my need for external stimulation and variety and all that sort of stuff. But what then can happen is the extrovert side of us will be, oh, we need some people. We need to go out and get some external stimulation. It is essentially what the extrovert side is saying. I call it peopling. We need to do some peopling. Our extrovert side will say, we go out and we do some peopling, and then our HSP side will go, oh, too much, and then we have to kind of retreat and go back and rest and recover and recharge, which is what an introvert does. So it's kind of that constant push-pull between our two sides that is usually a HSP extrovert's biggest battle, is trying to balance those two completely contradictory sides of our personality.
I think I am really resonating with this, and I'm actually just having this experience moving back from Japan, and we moved back to our same community and the same house even. And I've always kind of described myself as like an extrovert introvert, or an introvert, because I am like that. Like, I came home and I have all these people that want to see us and inviting us for dinners and stuff. And I'm like, okay, this is fun. And then all of a sudden I'm like, okay, I'm not trying to ignore you, but for the next 4 days, I'm not going to be responding, because I literally don't have that. It's too, the ups and the downs and stuff is pretty extreme. And I like what you're saying about the peopling and, visiting everyone, but then I just need to, kind of go back into my shell and stay there and decompress for a while before I can go out and do that again.
Yeah, exactly. And that doesn't surprise me, because what I find is the people that invite me on their podcast quite often end up being HSP extroverts. And I think that's because somewhere in my messaging, when I reach out to you to say, hey, would you like me to be a guest on your podcast, I think something resonates, obviously. And the other thing that you said, which is a term that a lot of HSP extroverts say, is extroverted introvert or introverted extrovert. So that is a very common experience, what you describe. And what can actually happen is, because you repeat that cycle as you've described, you kind of go out and you catch up with friends and you do all this stuff, and then you need to retreat. What can often happen is HSP extroverts end up thinking that they're introverts because they think they can't cope with the going out, because what they see is they see other people who are extroverts kind of doing it all the time and getting recharged and getting energized by that sort of stuff. And then they kind of go, oh, well, that's not really me. So maybe I'm not an extrovert. And then it just starts kind of causing all of this confusion in them. And so many ladies that I've met along the way think they're introverts, but they're actually HSP extroverts. And it's because of that cycle that you've just described, that kind of going out, needing to retreat, going out, needing to retreat. Sometimes eventually people stop going out because they don't understand that it's just those two sides to ourselves that just need to be balanced. And once they recognize that, I think it's almost like a relief, and it's almost like a permission to go, oh, well, okay, it's okay to be like that. I just need to recognize when I've reached my peopling limit so that I can then go back into my shell or into my comfort zone and rest and recharge. So, yeah, your experience is very similar to what a lot of my ladies describe, for sure.
And so if you had to give some other, character traits of the HSPE, other than some of the ones we've talked about, what are some of the other ways that you would describe them?
Okay, so the other way to describe them is I think they're so HSPs in general are very, very good at connecting with people. But I think HSP extroverts have that added advantage that their extrovert side kind of pushes them to go out and connect. So I think they're very, very good people. So they're very good at connecting. They're like, I had a lady in my group, one of my clients, she shared this amazing story of just bumping into a lady in a shopping centre car park. She just got chatting to her. She just had this sense, because it would have been her sensitive to subtleties, picking up that something was a bit off with this lady. The lady ended up in tears, sharing that she'd had this awful day. She was trying to ironically teach sensitivity to her class. She was a teacher. She didn't know about HSPs, but I think she was trying to teach the boys to be more sensitive or something. And she'd copped it a little bit from the principal about, I don't know, she was going outside of what she should be doing or something. So she'd been really upset by it. And so this is just this random stranger that my client just started chatting to. She was able to share with her about HSPs, give her a bit of education, get her to understand that she probably was, which is why she was having this reaction to the feedback from the principal. So I think that's a beautiful example of the difference that HSP extroverts can make in the world, because we meet people, we're very good at connecting with them. They almost feel our empathy, so they then open up, because that's what happens to me a lot of the time. I'll meet someone and the next minute they're telling me their darkest secrets or their biggest challenges because they feel comfortable with us. So I think that's definitely another strength of HSP extroverts. One of the big challenges that often comes with being a HSP extrovert, or there are a few, but one of them is we tend to put too much on our plate. And that's because our extrovert side gets excited. So we go, oh, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. And you can probably relate to this. Like when you came back from Japan, you probably thought, right, I'm going to catch up with all of these people. And then we schedule all this stuff. And then a HSP side goes, oh my gosh, well, I can't cope with this. And we end up having to either cancel plans, postpone plans, because our extrovert side gets excited. We pile all this stuff on our plate. And that includes things like, my ladies sign up for, instead of just signing up for an online course, they'll sign up for 5 online courses and think they're going to be able to do it all because they get excited. So that's another example of, that whole kind of contradictory push-pull of their personality going on. You want me to keep going, or do you have any comments about?
I felt bad, but I actually sent messages to quite a few people, and I said, I hope that you don't take this personally, but just due to the nature, and I want to speak on self-care, but I'm like, due to me being, honoring myself, I know I've been home for 3 weeks, and it's not a reflection of our friendship or that I like other people better. I just know that I can't pack, day after day after day of stuff in, because it's just too overwhelming. And so I think most people know me well enough to know that, okay, yeah, like I'm not going to take that personally, that, you've been home 3.5 weeks and you haven't come see me yet. But, um,
And do you know, sorry to
yes,
interrupt, can I stop you there? That is such a HSP way of handling it too, because we're so concerned with others and we're very others focused. So you're worried about offending the other person, whereas a non HSP would probably just go, I'm too tired, can't do it, cancel. Whereas HSPs do exactly as you just described. We're very concerned about our actions, and in this case, you cancelling on somebody, how that's going to land with them, which I think is a beautiful part of our trait. But it can also be what exhausts us as well, because if we take it too far and we become too others focused, then our own needs get kind of ignored as well. So sorry to interrupt, but yeah, that was just such a HSP way of handling that whole situation that I wanted to point that out.
well, I think about it in terms, I don't know if you're familiar with the writer Carlos Castaneda, and he talks about warriorship. And one of the aspects of the warrior is to manage accessibility. So how accessible we are, not even just to the people, but to the world. And, in some of his writings, he would talk about like a warrior kind of, dips into his world. He touches his world lightly and as much as needed, and then knows when to retreat. And I think a lot about that in terms of accessibility with, technology and smartphones. And now, somebody sends you an email or a text and they know that you see it. And how do you navigate those waters of, I still need to be mindful of myself and my own self-care. And yet I know that I'm always basically accessible if I choose to be. So is this a big issue, especially technology and boundaries and all of those kind of good things? Is that even more important for HSP and HSPEs?
Definitely, yeah. Technology, emails, text messages, Facebook Messenger can be HSP's worst nightmare because, again, because of that others focus thing. And a lot of HSPs, until they learn healthy boundaries, are people pleasers. And so even just living in today's world where we are so accessible can be overwhelming in itself. So it is very important for HSPs to set healthy boundaries. And one of the things I talk to my ladies about is just because the phone rings, you don't have to answer it. Just because a text message comes through, you don't have to get back to it straight away. It is about, and because, as you describe, the way technology is, we are accessible. People can see if we've read things. Now, I advise, if possible, turn that function off.
Yes,
So that takes an extra layer of pressure away. But it is really about putting some healthy, strong boundaries in place for yourself and recognizing that my time is valuable too. I will get back to them, but I'll get back to them when I have time, when I have energy. And that really is, it sounds easy, but it's quite difficult for a HSP to do. And I think because another challenge that often comes with being a HSP is self-worth, and self-esteem is often quite a challenge. And that comes from the fact that HSP have what's called vantage sensitivity. So what that means is that we respond better, quicker and faster to positive interventions and positive experiences, but we're also more damaged by negative or unhealthy, unhelpful experiences. So what that means in a nutshell is that a HSP who grows up with a less than ideal childhood, a HSP that suffers any sort of trauma, ends up more damaged as an adult. And so self-worth and self-esteem, as you can imagine, are what suffer when we go through trauma and when we allow people to walk all over us. So one of the things I work on with my ladies is building up their self-worth and their self-esteem so that they do feel more comfortable in putting those boundaries in place. And even though that sounds, I always like to follow that up with, because that sounds like quite doom and gloom, like we're more damaged by things that happen to us. But on the plus side, therapy, counselling, coaching, HSPs thrive in those environments because of the same reason they're more damaged. They end up kind of getting healed faster because of the vantage sensitivity. So it's like two sides of the same coin, but all of that kind of flows into what's necessary in order to put healthy boundaries in place. So I've got a lady at the moment who is in a very toxic relationship. I run a monthly support chat, or 2 monthly support chats for the ladies in my group. And she was talking about this guy. They were engaged. I can't remember all the specific details, but they were engaged. I think he essentially ghosted her, but it's a classic case of he throws out the hook, she takes it, he reels her in, then he gets bored of her, rejects her, she goes through the whole experience again, and then he'll start. It's like a game that he's playing with her. And so getting her to see that she doesn't have to put up with that is one of the biggest challenges that I experience with my clients, is getting them to a place where they, because what's happened now is the guy has, or he has told her, I don't know if it's true or not, he has told her that he's got a brain tumour. So guess what that's done? That sucked her right back in again. So just about the time when she got strong enough to stay away, this happened. So that's kind of, I'm waiting on the next installment. She's actually just reached out to me, and she might be joining my group membership to get a little bit more support on it. But that's a classic example of a HSP falling into this cycle, not feeling strong enough or worthy enough to put those boundaries in place to stop that harm, emotional harm that's being done to them by that other person. So that's a very common thing that I come across.
Is there any other, because you talk about being HSPE is kind of their sensitivity is their superpower, which I kind of, and when you're talking about that, you mentioned their intuition and just being able to notice things. And I think probably when you do notice, even when, you get your hair cut and you were talking about maybe your husband or your boyfriend doesn't notice that you got your hair cut. But when somebody does notice those small things, it does light them up a little bit, like, oh, wow, like I feel appreciated, I feel acknowledged, all of those things. And so I imagine there's a lot of beautiful things about being able to have that level. I guess it would increase a sense of intimacy or vulnerability when you can have those moments that other people might not notice.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's what builds the connection that we can make with people so easily, is because we notice those things, we mention those things, because we are others focused. And just to clarify, I would suggest that all HSPs have superpowers. Obviously, I just focus on the extroverts, but not taking away from the HSP introverts. But you're exactly right. That's what I'm kind of getting at when I say our sensitivity is our superpower, because I honestly believe that the traits of HSPs are so sorely needed in today's world, because today's world is, even though we're more connected in terms of, you're in the USA, I'm in Australia, I'm in a relatively remote location on the beach in my caravan, and we're still talking. So in that sense, we're kind of more connected than ever, but the world is actually more disconnected than ever in terms of loneliness, mental health issues, all that sort of stuff. And I think HSPs have the ability to, as you just mentioned, light up somebody's day or light somebody's world just for a moment, or build those connections with people, make somebody feel a lot better about an experience they just had, like I said that my client did with that lady in the car park that she met that got really upset. So that's why I say that it's a superpower, because I just think there's so many beautiful aspects of being HSP, and that's what my mission is, to get HSPs to focus on those, because they have this tendency to grow up feeling like there's something wrong with them, and the HSP extroverts in particular, because they're a minority within a minority. My goal is to flip that so that they stop seeing, because a lot of them come to me, and I see it in the big HSP groups as well. There's a lot of lamenting and poor me, and I wish I wasn't HSP, and I'm trying to flip that and say, well, actually, if you overcome the challenges, because yes, there are challenges, just like any minority group, there are challenges. If you learn to accept that you are HSP, start to focus on the positives, overcome the challenges that come with it, move past any trauma, self-worth, any of that sort of stuff, which is easier to do for a HSP, as we've just mentioned. If you can do those things, then you get to a place where you go, wow, I can bless the world. I can bless these people that I'm interacting with, just with a moment of joy or a moment of true human to human connection. And that's when you start to go, yep, we can make a significant difference to the world if we embrace our sensitivity.
Could you repeat for me again the technical term besides HSP?
Sensory processing sensitivity.
So, is that something that if you were looking more from a biomedical model, is that something that's recognized first from a biomedical model? And how would they go about treating that? Because we're talking, a lot more about emotional well-being and some spirituality and intuition and that sort of thing. But in when they're using that technical term, are these things that is well researched and explored, like well known, they'll do better with counseling and all of that, kind of the positive traits that you mentioned? How would they
Yes.
deal with that more from a medical perspective?
Well, the thing is, because it's a trait, you're born this way. So it really is about, the way I describe it is, I like helping people become evolved HSPs. So it's about using that vantage sensitivity to overcome any challenges that they may have through growing up or whatever their issues are. And then so once they've overcome the challenges, then they can start to embrace the positives and kind of grow even further and take it to that next level. So from a biomedical perspective, there really isn't anything that can be done, so to speak, because it is a trait that we're born in. So it's like you're born an introvert or you're born an extrovert, you're born a HSP or you're not. So it's not something that necessarily needs to be cured, and that's a big thing that I talk about, because and that's why I don't like using the term SPS, because if you say I have SPS, it sounds like there's something wrong with me,
Mm-hmm.
whereas I say I'm an HSP and I'm proud of it. That's usually how I follow up that statement. So I think really it is just about learning to overcome the challenges, focus on the positives, and it can be done. And as I keep saying, because of the vantage sensitivity, excuse me, it's easier to do.
So the reason I ask that is because I actually know several children within my circle that have been told that they have the sensitivity, and like several of them, like for example, all growing up, they bought him soft pants because he didn't like the way that jeans and stuff would feel. And so they didn't speak to it, just didn't seem like it was being conveyed in such an enlightened way as the way that you are conveying it, which I'm sure makes sense. So I was just wondering if they had approaches, if they realized that there were approaches that were I guess more enlightened in how they dealt with it. So
Yeah, I think, and that's a really good point. I think what the challenge is, it's still a relatively unknown area. So there are a lot of people out there who have never heard of it, and particularly with children, they can be misdiagnosed a lot of the time as well. So I've had clients who said that they've been diagnosed as ADHD, bipolar disorder, autism spectrum. Now, some of the diagnoses, I'm not saying they're all wrong, but I wonder if some of those diagnoses would have been different if the medical professional knew about sensory processing sensitivity or being a HSP. So I think that's probably where there's perhaps a bit of a gap, and that's one of the things that I'm trying to obviously educate people about as well, because Elaine Aron actually wrote a book, The Highly Sensitive Child, I'm pretty sure it's called, because one of the thing that I think we're in a beautiful position to do now is help the current children HSPs grow up knowing that there's nothing wrong with them, because we all grew up thinking there was something wrong with us because nobody knew about HSP. Whereas now that some people know about it, and I'm trying to get more and more people to know about it, we can actually nurture those children so that we can then end up preventing a lot of the harm by just getting them to, just educating them really, and teaching them that yes, you're different, but that's okay. Here's the great things about being a sensitive. And we have a really great opportunity, I think, to mold that new generation of HSPs so that they don't suffer as much as what we did because we didn't know.
Yes, I know I have a friend who I would describe as, she might be an HSPE, but I remember her telling me about her childhood, and everybody would always say, "Why are you so sensitive? You're so sensitive, everything," and that, it was very damaging to her growing up, always thinking that something was wrong with her. And she just, I mean, as you said, it was a trait. It wasn't like it was a choice to perceive the world in the way that she did. And that was something she really had to unlearn as she got older, is that, yeah, there's nothing wrong with her, and her sensitivity wasn't something that, yes, it was different, and yes, she noticed things, and in many ways she was more sensitive than the average person, but that wasn't a bad thing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that Elaine Aaron is out there, perhaps not so much anymore, but I'm definitely out there trying to show that. Because, and one of the things that I sometimes say to my ladies, jokingly but kind of seriously, if people say to them, "Oh, you're too sensitive," one of the comebacks could possibly be, "Well, maybe you're too insensitive." So it's about kind of learning to educate people about it, because I think every HSP on the planet has been called too sensitive, too emotional. The HSP extroverts are often called too much, because we can be, when we're in our high energy and our happy energy, we can be quite overwhelming and overpowering. And most HSP extroverts that I've spoken to have an experience of meeting someone, thinking they're a kindred spirit. We start pouring our hearts out to them, and then they start kind of backing away, kind of like, "Whoa, who is this crazy person?" So that's a very classic experience of a HSP extrovert. So again, part of my mission is to kind of say, but that's okay. Because on the flip side of that, yes, we can overwhelm people sometimes with our energy, but on the flip side of that, our good energy and our positive energy is contagious, and we can light up a room, we can light up somebody's day just by being us. And the people that kind of back away, well, maybe they're just not our people, because they just can't handle us at full proof, as I say. Like, they're just not our people, and that's okay. And then also we can obviously learn to read the signs as well, and perhaps not dive in so deep so quickly, but but it's our excitement and our enthusiasm that causes us to do that. And I don't want to kind of ever encourage people to not be like that, because that's another one of the beautiful strengths that I think HSP extroverts have, is that bubbliness, that contagious energy that they bring to certain situations. But I think, yeah, being called too sensitive, too emotional, too much is very common. And I think one thing we can do is, as you say, if it happened growing up, we need to unlearn it and recognise that we're not like that. We're just different to the majority of the population. But also start to maybe practice some comebacks on what we could say if somebody said that to us. And I thought one thing that might be helpful right now, because we haven't covered it yet, is I keep talking about HSP extroverts, a minority within a minority. But I should probably give you some statistics to
Sure.
kind of explain that. So they say HSPs are about 15 to 20% of the population. Of those 15 to 20%, 70% are introverts, which means only 30% of the 15 to 20% are extroverts. So it took me a while to figure out the maths, but the maths basically mean that HSP extroverts make up about 6% of the population. So round about 1 in 20 people are HSP extroverts. So that's why I say we're a minority within a minority, because HSPs are a minority already, and then you add extrovert to that, and then we become an even smaller minority. So that hopefully gives your listeners a bit more kind of info. So essentially 1 in 5 people you meet is probably a HSP, but 1 in 20 would be a HSP extrovert.
You have I think it's a course about not taking things personally. What are a
Yep.
few of the tips or tools from that course that helps people? Because on one hand, and I guess maybe that's a contradiction in itself too, right? Sometimes when I look out, especially at the landscape of social media, I do think people are too sensitive and they haven't done enough inner work. And there's a lot of people complaining and whining and wanting the world to alter and shift for their own, kind of, I guess it's narcissism, but so what are some of the, and that's actually the 4 agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz. And one of the agreements is don't take things personally. And so I love that. So I was just wondering, what is like maybe 1 or 2 of the things that you like to hit home in that course?
Yep. So first of all, can I just address what you said about the too sensitive, because I see that too. And what I like to say is that there's a lot of people out there who are hypersensitive. And hypersensitivity means people who have not learned, they're emotionally fragile and they haven't learned to manage their own emotions. So they're the ones who are expecting the world to change because their feelings got hurt or they got triggered. Whereas it's, as you say, it's about doing the inner work so we can own our own stuff, and then we're not hypersensitive anymore. So non-HSPs can be hypersensitive and HSPs can be hypersensitive. So I like to make that distinction, just because HSPs can cop a bad rap, because when you say highly sensitive, people immediately think of those people that you're talking about who just are up in arms about every tiny little thing. So I just like to kind of bring that term in, because I think it helps just differentiate between somebody who is hypersensitive, emotionally fragile, and someone who is highly sensitive. So yeah, sorry about the sideline there.
No, I'm glad, because that was
that.
actually what I really wanted to address as well. So
Cool. So back to tools to stop taking things personally. That's such a mouthful. I think I'm going to have to rename it. But essentially, there's a couple of main gists of that training, I suppose. First of all, most human beings are very egocentric. So a lot of the time when we're taking things personally, and Don Miguel Ruiz talks about this, it's got nothing to do with us. It's their stuff that is coming at us. And so one of the simple things that I teach them is, what's an alternative interpretation? So what's the story that you've made on that? Like, say, for example, you're in an office and you look over and you see a couple of colleagues whispering, they look up at you and then they look back down. Most people would jump to the conclusion, oh, they're whispering about me, because we're egocentric, because we kind of, it's human nature, not just HSPs, but everybody. We make things about us that often are not about us. So I ask them to kind of stop, almost become like step outside their own thought process and think, okay, well, that's the meaning that I put on that little situation, but what other meaning could I put on it? And I teach them to maybe sometimes come up with some crazy, ridiculous, funny interpretations as well, so that they can start to see how powerful their interpretations are, and how you could actually say, oh, well, those people are scared of me. They think I'm a witch and I'm going to put a curse on them. That's why they're whispering. Like, just stupid stuff like that, which is a valid interpretation. So you can, once you start to look at it that way, you're better able to separate yourself from that immediate reaction that happens in that immediate thought process that happens in your mind. And the other, because since I've done the course, I'm going to add a new module to it soon, because what I've covered so far doesn't tackle what happens if people are trying to get you to take something personally. So if it is personal and they are trying to hurt you, and one of the tips I give in that situation is, I'm not sure if this would be the same for HSP introverts, but definitely HSP extroverts. Most of us have a little inner rebel, and I think it's part of our extrovert side. So we've got that little inner rebel that doesn't want to be manipulated, doesn't want to do what we're told kind of thing. So I say, well, sometimes it's helpful to let her come out. So what I do, because I learnt this in high school because I had some issues with some of the mean girls. And one of the things I learnt quite early on was the last thing I'm going to let them know is that they got to me. So that's when my little inner rebel comes out. I'm not going to let them see me cry, or I'm going to be tough in that moment. There's still a process that you then need to work through so that you don't kind of hang on to that, because you might have taken it personally but not shown them that you did. So there's still a process to go through to kind of unravel that in your own mind so that you don't hang on to it. But in the meantime, that's just a little tip that I give them, is just don't give them the satisfaction, particularly if somebody's deliberately trying to hurt you or upset you or goad you. Don't give them the satisfaction, because that's essentially a manipulation. So I just go, nah. The little rebel comes out, no, I'm not going to let you get me to go down that path. I'm going to go down this path instead. And there are a couple of tips that I hope your listeners find helpful on that.
Oh, yes. I talk about my inner rebel all the time. So I hope you do write that book, because I am very interested in reading it now that I'm pretty sure I fell into this category.
Awesome. Well, the book's already started, so it's a work in progress at the moment. So it's just a case of finding some more time. Keep going.
Well, I hope that you do, and maybe I'll have you on again. I know you've written extensively on your website about narcissism too, which I think is a fascinating topic, but we don't have time to get to that today. But maybe you can come on again and we can talk about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. That'd be great, because that is a big challenge for HSPs. Is we tend to be, I don't know if there's any science behind this, but through speaking to lots of HSPs and I run a free boundaries challenge in my group as well to teach them how to set boundaries. The number of HSPs that have been victim of a narcissist is just, there's a lot. So I say that and it makes sense from when you understand what a narcissist is, it makes sense that a HSP would be a really juicy target for a narcissist to have, basically. So yeah, I'd be more than happy to come on and chat more about that another time.
Well, wonderful. This is where I let my guests just tell my listeners how they can find you. Anything you want to leave them with today.
Okay, great, thanks. So the best place to connect with me would be my free Facebook group. It's called Highly Sensitive Extroverts Bright Sparks. I also have my website, jennturnham.com, which is currently undergoing a bit of a revamp. And I'm on Facebook as well at Coach Jenn T. So if you feel like this is resonating with you and you might be a HSP extrovert, I would love for you to join the group, because one thing I've learned about HSP extroverts is one of the best things for us is to hang out with other HSP extroverts, because we're the minority within the minority. It's just a beautiful experience to actually be surrounded by women who get you and understand you, and you don't have to explain yourself all the time.
Well, I bet you that will be a very fun group.
It is. We have some cool discussions, that's for sure.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the program today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Well, I will be back after this ridiculously short break. Are you enjoying this podcast and want to help this lady out? Well, share it with friends, or even better, leave a review on iTunes. We'd love to hear from you. Now back to the show. Well, that is it for today's episode. Coming up on the next Chaos and Light podcast, we'll be speaking with Tom King and talking about sugar, what he calls diabesity, and what it's like to move to a ketogenic lifestyle. Well, that's it. Take care and seek the mystery.